So first of all, I'm using VS Code here, and I just put down some boilerplate HTML. And actually, if you have VS Code, you can do this shortcut. If you just type exclamation and tab, yeah, you'll get like this HTML boilerplate. I think that's part of Emmet, right? So it's a plugin for VS Code that allows you to do all these shortcuts. So you can really like cut down on your workflow. It's basically like instead of typing all your tags like an H1 and doing all the angle brackets and everything, you can just do something like if I did H1 and then hit tab, you see it just does it for me. Yeah, and then you can go right in there and type your text right in there. So it's got all these kind of abbreviated shortcuts that really like help you cut down time. Yeah, it's great. And I think all the code editors have that pretty much, the ability to do that. Yeah. So, like with this boilerplate, the basic things are just that I have my enclosing HTML tags on line 2 and line 13. And then within the HTML tags, you have two main sections, the head, right, which is line 3 through 8, which is like all the meta information about the document. And then the main part, the body, which is right now is line 9 and then through 12. This is where all of our element tags are going to go. H1s, P tags, lists, all that stuff. Yeah, so like I said, there's basically 3 ways that you can link up your CSS. The first way is to simply write it like in the element tag, which is called doing it inline. So you can do something like style equals, and then in quotes, you would do your property and value. So if I wanted to make this a color, you can see that turned it red. So this is like the first way to link up or sort of include CSS in your HTML. The second way is to, yeah, this is inline. Yeah. This is another way is to just write style tags in the head of the document. And here, like I can take that out and I can accomplish the same thing. And then the third way is actually to create like a separate file that we can link to. In the same directory, I'm just going to make a new file, and I'm going to call it styles.css. Right. So now in order to link to this, we just want to make a link tag in the head of the document. And for href, we're going to write the path to that file, which in this case, it's in this same directory, so we're going to do /styles.css. And just to see if it works, we'll do the same, you see, in the back. So this stuff here, this is called a rule, the CSS rule. In here we have a selector, which is the H1, which is the element, and then we have this declaration block here, the opening and closing curly braces, and then a property and a value. So we can do other things too, like we can change the font size. Well, that's already that. So what else can we do it? So we can write multiple property and values in there. Now, the way that we selected the H1 in this case, that's one way to select a tag. We can talk about like other ways to do it. Okay, if we just comment out that H1 rule, you notice that the H1 from the browser, it still has like a little bit of styling. Because if I was to do an H2 under there, you can see that the font size is smaller. Like the browser itself is giving some default stylings, and that's called the user agent style sheet. The user agent. This has to do with the whole idea of the cascade, because the first styles are going to come from the browser. And then after that, the CSS is going to be read from top to bottom. If we were to go back to using the style tags in the head section, okay, so that's coming after like the browser styling. So now we're going and kind of like overriding the default styles in the browser. But if we go down into the H1 element and do an inline style there, let's say like color green, now it's green. You see, even though like we have it here, we have it there, because that's the way that the browser is deciding which style is going to take hold. Basically, it's going from top to bottom. Yeah, like this is what. Yeah, this is like part of what the cascade idea is about. Now,
sort of it goes in order, but there's also an inline style is more weight to it than a style that's in the head too. Like if you have, it's a combination of things. Like they have certain. I remember somebody giving a talk about this where there's like this formula where some of this they get like a certain number and then it's added up, and depending on where the style is, definition, if you have conflicting definitions, like certain ones win different cases and whatnot. But
actually, yeah, the cool thing in VS Code is that you can see what Alex is talking about. Like if you hover over an element, can you see it there? You see where it says selector specificity? Like all these selectors, they're all given like a number calculation. And the more to the left, like if it started with 1, 0, 0 on another element or another type of selector, then that selector would take precedence, and that style would win out. Right? So, yeah, like VS Code has a lot of cool things like that, you know.
And I guess if you go to the browser and you see how the styles are crossed out, you know,
right? Yeah.
Apply multiple
yeah, because like
styles to one tag.
Yeah, because if a style has more specificity, then the ones that came before it will be crossed out because they're no longer applicable to that. I'm just going to take out this inline style again. And hold on a second. Let me see. Yeah, so now you can see that the word hello, it's taking the styles from the external style sheet because it has an underline and has a greater font size. And if you look in the HTML document, you can see that the style tags here are coming before the link tag. But if we were to switch that, one second. Oh yeah, I have to. Now, because I switched that, the style tags here, the color is overriding the color from the style sheet, the red. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Because it's in page, right?
Well, because I swapped the order. So like I said, the order goes from top to bottom. You know, like that's how the browser decides like which styles are going to apply. Okay, so right now it's going external style sheet, then this opening and closing style tag in the head, which is overriding the color in H1. Okay. There's also this thing called CSS reset, which there's a few popular ones out where you can load that first into your CSS, and that'll kind of like reset all the default stylings of the browser. So it's almost like you can start from, you're starting from scratch. You know, because like really like the H1 tag and the H2 tag, even though they have different sizes and things, what's really important is more the semantics of it. So where like an H1 is kind of like the main thing on your page, it could be like a heading or something. And that's why you would use an H2 and H3 or whatever after that, because maybe those are subtitles or subheadings and things like that. It's not so much for the size, you know. Even though you get that like from the defaults of the browser. So as far as like the reset thing, there's pros and cons to that though too, because some people say that then you have to do a lot more work to kind of like redo all the stylings and stuff. It can get a little confusing when you're applying styles and you forget that there were like default styles from the browser. Like something like if you do like an H, like an H tag, an anchor tag, an A tag, it has this default styling from the browser where it has a color and it's underlined. So if you wanted to change that, you would actually have to go and override that. Now we can also do other things to select this element, like we can do something called an ID. So we can just say, I don't know, whatever, heading, and in order to grab that ID, we want to do like a pound sign followed by the name that we gave that ID, and then we can do, you see. So this is another way of like targeting an element and applying styles to it is through an ID selector. And I'll talk a little bit more about like why you'd want to do that. Well, actually, I can show you right now. Like, let's say that I had two H1s. I don't know why I'm typing the word hello, but it's the only thing I could think of, But anyway,
normal, like hello world versus
yeah,
code.
I just don't want to type hello world. So let's say we had two H1s, and then if I use that's some nice music. I feel like I'm at Birdines or something. Now I have two H1s, right, in my HTML. So if I was to just target them with an element selector, an H1, and I wanted to color them red, I can do that because I've got my H1, which is going to target all of them. But what if I just want to do the second one? Well, I can give it an ID and just call it whatever. And if I select that with the ID selector, now I'm just able to target that one. Okay. Now what happens if I have three H1s? And I want to target just the last two. So how am I going to do that? Like if I did that with an element selector, H1, all three would become red. If I use an ID, which is supposed to be reserved for just one unique HTML tag, I would only be able to target one of them. So in this case, I can use a class. And you do that just like the ID, but you type the word class. You say class equals, we'll just call it heading. And then give my other element the same class name. And now I can target that, but instead of using the pound sign, you're going to target the classes with a period followed by the name you gave it. So now we should see the last two becoming red. And so that's a class selector. So we saw the element selector, the ID selector, and then the class selector.
ID must be unique and class can appear in multiple places.
That's the idea, yeah. If you try to use two IDs or more in the HTML, it will actually work as far as CSS goes. But that's not what it's meant for. So it's kind of supposed to be like invalid HTML. Because really, like the meaning of it is supposed to be used for just a single element. Now, if you were to try to grab that from JavaScript, if you did like document get element by ID, that would only get the first one, the first instance of it.
Yeah.
The other thing about these selectors, as far as what we talked about, there's the idea of specificity. The greatest specificity amongst these three is the ID. The second one is going to be the class, and the third one is just a general element selector. So in other words, if I, let me see. Let me see if I can create an example. Actually, wait, let me, I'm gonna,
Completely override one another, they don't merge.
right, whichever one has the greatest specificity is the one that will win. So if I just targeted that H1 with an H1 element selector, actually, hold on. I'm going to comment those and just to make it like less confusing. So if I target with an H1 and I say color red, now the color is going to be red. But if I now target that H1 by its ID, I do pound with the name of the ID, and I say color green. Now the ID is winning, basically winning the battle. Like if we do have these two things. If I targeted the class, you say color yellow. Right now the ID is still winning out because that has higher specificity than the class. But if I comment that out, well, what do you think is going to happen? You think we're going to see the H1 or the heading class? Yeah, right, because that has a higher specificity than the element selector. The basic element selector, the H1, is just kind of the most general, broad thing that you can do.
If you do just H1, it affects all the H1s on the page.
Yeah.
Versus the class or ID, it's only ones that you assign the class or ID to.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So Greg, the
Yeah.
order of specificity is ID, class, and then an on-style class.
And then the element selector, like the H1 or the P or the UL, which is an unordered list. If I did H1 anywhere in my HTML that I have an H1, then that's going to get that style. If we had two of the same selectors, for some reason we did this, and let me bring this back. Now you can see that the one that's further down in the actual file is the one that's going to win. So that's another kind of specificity, I guess. Here, even though we have the same element selector, it's the one on the bottom that's going to win. Like if I switch these two around, now it's going to become red.
So it's order, it's defined by order of appearance.
Yeah.
So the latest is what is taken.
Mm-hmm. And that's part of,
They have the same specificity. The one that's last
Okay.
wins.
yeah.
But you could have something that's after, but if it has a higher specificity, then higher specificity wins, I think.
Right, yeah. If the one after was an ID, then that one would win because the ID itself has greater specificity than just a generic element selector. But I think like this is also has to do with the idea of the cascade, where we're going from top to bottom. So the one that's red last is the one that would win out. Just in the same way that like we saw how the order of where we have like the link tag versus the style, opening and closing tags versus the inline styles, how the cascade applies there.
Wow, isn't there?
Yeah.
There like if you put like an exclamation point next to one, you can make one like the primary.
Yeah. So so that's actually the greatest specificity you can do, which is
There's a lot of.
to do this.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. By putting that exclamation mark in the word important, like that would even have the greatest specificity of anything. That would like override everything else that you could do, even like the inline styles. Once it starts getting like where your file starts getting really long, you start having hundreds of lines, and then sometimes it gets tricky. Like things happen, where you're not sure like where things are coming from. Like why is this style, not behaving in the way because it's being inherited from something else. So with like when I say inheritance, if we had just a div, does everybody know what a div is? It's just like an empty kind of container. It can be a way to sort of like group elements together and then work. Think of it sort of like as a grouper almost. It doesn't have any semantic meaning. If we have a div and then inside of that we put, let's say, some p elements, which are paragraphs. You can just do some dummy text. So if I were to target that div with an element selector, and I just said div, and then I said color, I said red, now all the children of that div are going to inherit that color property, simply because they're nested inside of the div. So sometimes like things do get a little tricky like that, where you can't figure out what's going on. So you have pseudo classes, and then you have pseudo elements. There's a couple different types. One of them is called a dynamic pseudo classes. If you had an anchor tag, you can now add what's called a pseudo class, and you do that by first doing the name of the element, followed by a colon. For anchor tags, you have link and hover. I'll show hover because that's like maybe probably the most common one, where somebody, when you put the mouse over, you're going to have something change. So maybe, I don't know, we'll say the font size is going to be, I have no idea. Let me see. So just by hovering over it, because I had that pseudo class here, that's now taking the styles that I included in the rule. As far as the pseudo classes like that, there's a few others with the anchor. There's visited, so you can do that. We'll give that a color, so that's going to be red. I don't know why I like red. It's just the most obvious one to see. I'll just comment out the hover. For some reason, it thinks I visited that. Just say, like Wikipedia. Okay, so now now it's blue. If I were to actually go to Wikipedia, you can already see though that it's changed to red. This anchor tag is now in a different state, showing the user that this is a link that you visited before. But you can use all these together. You can have the hover and the visited, and you could have there's another one called link, which is the color of the link itself. Just a yellow. Right now it's still red because we already went to this. But try to.
Why do you call it a pseudo class?
What's that?
Why do you call it a pseudo class?
I could contrast this by showing what's called a pseudo element. And hold on, let me just see. There's hover visited link, and then there's active. Before I move away from this, I'll just say be purple. So that's like when I click on it, the color it becomes because it's active. The pseudo element. So let's go back to the H1 that we had here. Now, usually this is written with 2 colons instead of 1. You could say like first letter. So I just gave that first color. That first letter, the color red. It's called a pseudo element because you can kind of imagine that we actually went around that H and put tags in there. They're not really there. But we created like a fake element. Maybe that would be a span tag. Could do that as well. You can also do like first line, which in this case we only have one line, but if I do, just get the first line. Another thing you can do is this thing called before, where you can actually insert like content before the content that you see. There's a property called content, and let's just say that we just wanted to put like some quotations there. You see they appear there, then we can like style that however we want. Maybe change the font size. So maybe you can present something like a block quote or a quote on the page. So like those pseudo elements, they don't actually exist in the DOM. Like we couldn't get at them with JavaScript. But they'll still appear on the page. I mean, you could also do after and put that at the end, or you can use both of them to do that as well. These also work with just the single colons. If I do that, it'll still work, but it's sort of the standard to distinguish them with two colons. One other thing I could show, just to finish out the pseudo class thing, is this concept called nth of type and nth child, which are more ways of selecting your elements. And since we actually have an unordered list here, we can try it on that. So I'm just going to get all this off the screen. If I wanted to target like a particular list item, I could use a pseudo class called nth of type like that. And this is sort of like a function in that it takes an argument in the parentheses. I have to give it a number to tell it which li I want to target. So let's say I wanted to target the second one, so the word 2 in there. I would just put a 2 in here, and then see if that, you see, so just hit that 2. So if I wanted to just get the fourth one, these are just like more ways to get in there and get specific. This applies to siblings. So you're really looking at like a group of sibling elements to determine what it's going to get applied to. As far as the inheritance thing I talked about, like if we selected that whole UL, we gave that a color, all the actual list items are going to inherit that from the parent UL. To go along with the nth of type, you also have nth child. So I'll comment this one out. This one works a little bit differently. Right now, I put nth child 1, and the first child element of that UL happens to be an LI. So it's going to apply that property to that LI. But if I were to go in here and do like a span tag, now it's not, because it's looking at that. It's looking at those children inside of UL, and it's saying like, is the first one of type LI? And it's not, so it's not applying it. If we did nth of type, and then we selected 1, that would get it, because now it's just looking at the actual type as opposed to its parent-child relationship. So if I actually wanted to get that LI with nth child, I would have to do number 2, because that's the second child within that parent. So a span is like an inline div. So if I just had a div, like I'll just create a div, let's say an empty div here. And I'll just give it a style of I'm just giving it like a border. This is a 1 pixel border, so it's just super basic. There's no height to it. But this kind of shows you like what a div really is. It's just this block level element that spans across the entire width of the viewport of the browser. If I was to do a span, let me just put a span in. and do the same thing. I don't know if you can see that, but I'm going to comment out the div. So you see the span there? There's like no content there, but that's like if I just selected a span and applied like the minimal border to it, that's what you get. You know, there's no like block level to it. It's an inline element. Let's say I had an H1 here. Put some dummy text in there. And then let's say that this third word, I just wanted to target that word, and I wanted to give that a color. What I can do is come in here and I can put that word within a span, and now if I target that span, you see, I think of it like a div, but an inline div. Because a div is like a generic container. Like a div doesn't have any meaning in itself, but if I had two, let's say, block level elements and I wanted to group them, let's say I had a div and I had two H1s in there. All right, and then I wanted to group those somehow, like let's say I just select the div and I create a border. You know, now that div, because it's grouping both H1s, it's causing them to act like a unit, being able to be controlled like a unit. And because of inheritance, anything I apply to that div, children of it will inherit that property. But it's basically a way to group elements together, and so you can manipulate them in different ways. You know, like I could choose to decrease the width, let's say, and then maybe center them, you know, together. Now instead of going to each H1, I said, okay, this is one group of content, and I want to work with that as one thing. So I'm going to decrease the width, and I'm going to center that. So it's a little bit to me like the span. It's also just like a span doesn't mean anything in itself. You know, as where H1 it has some sort of meaning, or if I say like section or article, those are other tags with meaning. Like a span doesn't really have a meaning. It's just that whatever's enclosed in that span, now we can manipulate that as an inline element, and we can do like styling to it, increase the font size, the font weight, or whatever.
Would that capture a range of characters?
I mean, it's whatever we enclose within it. So if I wanted to get like those last three words, I would just move the closing tag to the end of the sentence. So now all the styles I apply to that span are going to apply to those last three words. You know, I mean, I could take that and just, get the D, the letter D. So if I tried to take that span and I did height like 100 pixels, you know, nothing's happening. If I did width 100 pixels, nothing's happening because it's an inline element. There's a way to work with that with a property called inline block. So if we wanted to see that, just see the contrast, you could do display inline block. You see, and now that span is getting a height and a width. So it's sort of like an in-between between inline and block.
Inline block is awesome because if you need to format something without disturbing the flow around it, like the layout around it, then inline block is a composition method. So inline in the sense that it's not going to disturb anybody, but block in the sense that you can play around with the height. Like for example, the divs, you can change the height, you can change the width, you can change all that stuff because it's a block level element. Inline, you don't get that.
So if the sentence was longer and would wrap around, the text would go around that one?
No, it wouldn't go around that block. It would just continually flow. That's why spans are perfect for formatting something, like maybe in the middle of a paragraph, because it's not going to disturb the paragraph around it. And you can color it, highlight it, bold it, and for structure, you can use your block level elements.
We're just illustrating the difference between block and inline. So inline block is sort of like an in-between, because inline by itself, you can't do any height or width to it, right? Because it just wants to sit there like one word is just going to sit there in the flow of the text. So in order to kind of overcome that, you can say display inline block to get a width and a height to it.
Can you take that out?
Yeah. We could explicitly just set it back to inline, now it lost the height and the width, and that's a span right there by itself.
So the inline block is invoking the height and the width?
Right.
Because height and width are properties of block elements. Right? So, but the trade-off with using a block is that nobody can sit next to it. And so that might not be ideal for your structure. So if you want to preserve structure and get the benefits of a block, they provide you an inline block. And that declaration you saw was a display inline block. By default, as we said, like a div is blocked by default. The browser sets it that way. A span is inline by default. The browser sets it that way. H1 is a block. But using CSS, you can change how it interacts. Like we can take these divs now and we can make them inline. And they're all going to sit next to each other and they're not going to have that long width.
Yeah, we could do H1. Whoop. Like, let's just see what happens if we take H1 and just say display inline. Hold on a second. It's something else that's going on here.
Can you do that with all the divs?
What's that?
Can you, the div declaration, make all the divs inline?
Yeah, it's the div that I want to do.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Now
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, those,
not optional.
where it said lorem, where before they were display block, they would take up the entire width. Now they're inline because we explicitly said display inline, and so all they're taking up is just the room they need to, in order for the word to appear.